Can I invite up to the stage SDGs 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11? I will introduce you when you're seated. The same rules, please. 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Thank you. Right, the good news is we only have 5 goals to cover, not 6, so we can hopefully get through it just as quickly. So, representing SDG 7, we have Anthony Watanabe. He's the Managing Director of Asia Clean Innovations. Representing SDG 8, we have Risha Mittal, Director of Research and Innovation at the Fair Labour Association. Representing SDG 9, we have Ramesh Subramaniam, the Director of Operations, Services and General Management at Asia Development Bank. Are we missing somebody? 11. We're missing 11. Thank you. Representing SDG 10, we have Nagesh Kumar, Director of the Social Development Division of UN SCAP. And do we have Vikram? We might get Vikram later, but we only seem to be down to 4. So we won't get some feedback on SDG 11 at this point. Okay, same format. We'll do it in the same direction if that's all right. So Anthony, if you could kick off with your 3 minutes, and if we could make sure we focus on that bit at some point on what does business need from government on SDG 7.
Excellent, with pleasure. Congratulations to Responsible Global Initiatives, because our panel was really rich in its diversity. We had a developer of large-scale solar plants from China that recently branched out into the UK with 1 gigawatt total installed capacity, and a very innovative model around building solar farms in the shape of a panda, so to really attract attention. We had the Alliance for Rural Electrification, talking about reaching those hard-to-reach off-grid communities and what are the policy and financing mechanisms necessary there. We had ANZ Bank with their rather new division of sustainable finance and what that means for how they're working with both big institutional corporate customers to help them transition to clean energy, and then even residential homeowners for rooftop solar. And then we had a Chinese startup that was leveraging CSR funds and crowdfunding to deliver solar PV to rural schools in China. So really geographically and coming at it from different sectors, quite rich and diverse. I think one of the big calls to action came from Katerina from the Alliance for Rural Electrification, who said if this is the goal for 2030 and this is the pace of our development today, we need to increase that pace of change by tenfold in order to reach that goal by that date. I think that was a wonderful frame and a call to action, and a bit of a whoa to set the conversation and mobilize, I think, all of us going forward. Policy, the innovation is in the title of the conference. Anytime you talk about business, innovation is going to be there. When you were talking about sustainability and so on, innovation is part of the DNA. What we wanted to look at was what is the dynamic between innovation and regulation? And you hinted upon this a moment ago, and I think a question from an earlier session. And how do they play together? And it's I think well accepted that where the right policy is in place, it opens the door for business innovation to flow, and then ideally everybody benefits. Were there examples to the contrary where innovation is pushing regulation or waiting for it to catch up? And what are the pros and cons of that differing dynamic? And one example that came up, I think that was quite interesting, was in China, a central government policy to promote solar PV that was good and had all the right parameters in place, but then at the local, provincial level, the officials who were responsible for final approval, for moving stuff forward and getting it on the ground, had fear, limited knowledge, and ultimately proved to be an obstacle. And it was only through entrepreneurial kind of, I think, determination that the 6 months turned into finally a success, and hopefully more to follow. But in other cases, there might be an outright failure there. So cooperation across government levels to ensure that good policy is implemented is a key part of this innovation/regulation. And then we learned an interesting statistic about Australia, where rooftop solar on residential properties is, I think, one of the most successful such markets anywhere in the world. And that's, again, policy that's driving it, and then a whole host of other things that flow from that. We talked about partnership as well. Again, one of the goals, and a lot of people's favorite goal, in fact, a very important one. And I think across this spectrum of participants, panelists, partnership was universally welcomed and recognized as a key methodology for going forward. There were two areas of caution, though. I thought those were very good. One was trust, transparency, and the role of data to drive that trust, and that's important. And then this one I thought was really interesting was reciprocity and equal participation, and the need for these two elements in ensuring long-lasting partnerships, not sort of short-term blips. We talked about financing the transition to clean energy. It was widely accepted that money is available. However, there are different strata. The bigger projects get a lot of attention, get a lot of profile. The smaller, numerous, more decentralized projects are harder to finance. Transaction costs are high, and you need different funding mechanisms in that. And part of that is the role of multilaterals to help mitigate the risk, to help group, and so on. And so there's still a key role, although we heard about yesterday this UNDP report talking about the transition from ODA to private money, and that's happening for sure, but we're clearly in this transition period. We had an interesting question about life cycle assessment. It wasn't labeled as such, but I think it was very on point, talking about rare earth metals on the input side for solar PV, and then end-of-life scenarios, and what thought, if any, is put into end-of-life. And that brought up other issues for other sectors where things like extended producer responsibility policies are in place to help producers start to think about end-of-life scenarios and innovate in the design. And I think that's definitely coming for all kinds of clean energy technologies. And then finally, it was widely recognized that affordable access to clean energy is really an enabler for most, if not all, of the 16 other Sustainable Development Goals. And so we had a bit of a informal survey about what was the one or two key goals from our panelists that they think clean energy links into. And two of our panelists talked about education. So that was interesting, wonderfully interesting one, I think, a little bit unexpected. Partnership, and then water. So very dynamic, great discussions, not enough time to cover all the issues, but I think very good, thought-provoking, and driving forward.
Thank you. Thank you. Role of finance and regulation, as well as innovation. Risha.
Yes. So our group met, it was a multi-stakeholder group. I would say we had two companies, one NGO and government representative from the Philippines. It was about decent work and economic growth. And I would like to refer to the panel back, because you talked about transparency and accountability, and I think that was one of the key themes when it came around decent work and economic growth. Companies can, in globalization, when supply chains are transacting national boundaries, companies actually need to know how their product is being grown or mined or being produced or manufactured. But whatever they put out is seen as public relations. And they need validation, they need accountability, because Syngenta presented their example whereby their supply chain, when subjected to external monitoring, assessments, and published, actually forces them to take action, because it's not about what I know, it's about what public knows and what is their perception of the company. So accountability and transparency came out as a major theme. The second theme that came out is the regulatory framework. I think with the UK Modern Slavery Act, with the California Supply Chain Act, more and more governments will actually put out stricter regulatory frameworks around decent work principles. And what SDGs actually do is put a global attention on decent work, which I think is fantastic. We also talked about how principles of decent work, for example, living wage, actually touches upon many different SDGs, for example, hunger, poverty, access to education, access to health. And if companies have to look at it, they really can't look at it as a pilot project, or they can't look at it as something I'm doing here or there. It really has to go into the DNA of the company. It is how companies actually do business. And what would facilitate that is, of course, government having positive incentives, not punitive actions. So when we talk about decent work, we talk a lot about legal compliance. But for example, living wage is not necessarily about legal compliance, but how can the government facilitate that process? So we had a very good example from the Board of Investors of Philippines, where when they're looking at, so there's a fundamental shift in how they're looking at how they're going to invest, because it's not about regular businesses anymore, it's about inclusive business. So they're going to have companies who, so 50% of their indicators are really social indicators, 30% are profitability, and 20% innovation, so in that percentage. So I think governments have a role in terms of how do you promote companies who are doing ethics. I think insurance companies, banks, which you're talking about, they are looking at ethical investment portfolios. So companies will have to take action. We also talked, Verite presented a very good case study with what they're doing with Nestle and the Thai government. So it's not a single-handed company approach, but it's more like an action plan in collaboration with the Thai government, in collaboration with Nestle, where they're trying to demonstrate through demonstration boats, what best practices or good practices could look like. So, having where you have no guidance on, what the conditions should be on the boats, where you have workplace and living space at the same time. So at least having those kind of test cases and looking and proving that this is what can be done in that space. A lot of sensitization needs to happen at all levels about decent work, at the government level, at the company level, suppliers level, but also at the workers level. Because if we don't put workers at the center of it and workers don't demand their own rights, I think, it's a lost battle, honestly. Lastly, we also talked a little bit about, we talked about a lot of things, but gender came up in the issue. How can companies look at gender, and how can they facilitate workplace to be more gender friendly, to be more diverse, but also inclusive? We also talked about what is the role of trade unions in all this space, freedom of association, because they traditionally should be representing workers, and how their role has been kind of missing for some time. And should we go back to the old model where worker organizations kind of lead this space and have sectoral bargaining agreements? So, and I think companies do take stock that they need to engage with worker organizations, at least in the organized space, if not in the agriculture sector, where it's dominantly smallholder farmers. Last but not the least, I think hearing everything, what came out was companies cannot leave anyone alone. They have to have a people-centric approach. So it's not about risk management. It's not about materiality. They can't see workers as commodities. So if they start seeing workers as their assets, that's the way to go.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Ramesh, SDG 9.
Thanks, Harimesh. Welcome. Hope this is okay. I'll make one point by way of orienting everyone on what the goal is, and 3 points by way of summary. The point of orientation, you asked this morning, what is the most interesting goal? I don't know the answer to that, but certainly this goal is among the most complex ones. If you look at some of the sub-goals, it's pretty loaded. You've got industrialization, you've got innovation, and you've got infrastructure development. If you look at the adjectives in one of the sub-goals, for instance, you look at quality, reliability, resilience, sustainability, affordability, equity, and you've got the need to build regional and transformative infrastructure. And you've got inclusive and sustainable industrialization, you've got access to finance for MSMEs, SMEs, you've got adaptation for climate change, and you've got scientific capabilities for research and development and innovation. But we had a fantastic panel, very representative panel covering the private sector, the finance community, academic research community, as well as the public sector. We had Ruben Reynosa, Assistant Minister from the National Economic Development Authority in the Philippines. He gave Philippines, as well as broadly, I would think, ASEAN perspectives. Second was Jagan Srinivasan, Philips country manager from the Philippines, but again covering ASEAN, giving ASEAN perspectives as well as global perspectives. We had Victor Tay from Nanyang Technological University, given his previous experience in the public sector, as well as UN engagement. He gave a broader perspective, including on R&D. And finally, Leonie Chevret from ING, giving finance. Now, 3 points by way of summary, what came up in the discussion. Given the complexity of goals or the multidimensional nature of this goal, number one, there is certainly need for integrated thinking. When you look at, for instance, lighting, lighting is not just a product. Lighting is a space, it's a concept. There will be probably multiple ownership. A private good may become a public good by nature of its consumption. The other example is the Internet of Things will govern how we use products, how we use products that may probably become services for a broader community than we think. In the same light, when we look at infrastructure, urban is not really a sector. Urban is a multitude of different things. It's more a theme, and we need to approach this in a very integrated manner, and hence the need for not just public and private partnership, but partnership involving multiple actors and players. One perspective we did not have in the panel but was touched upon is how would civil society react to what is being done. So that's point number one. Point number two, what I took away from the panel discussions and from the questions that came up was that there seems to be certainly good news that businesses as well as public sector and other actors are moving from thinking from an unsustainability type of a frame of mind towards sustainability, but we are not ready. We don't have business models in all of these areas, certainly when we are looking at the three prongs of this goal number 9, and certainly change is needed everywhere. Just to give you a couple of examples, when we look at finance, finance is certainly, it needs to be sustainable over the medium to long term. There could be subsidy involved, but subsidy needs to be transparent and has to be fiscally responsible. But if you look at from the financial institutions' point of view, it looks like there is an emerging trend that you do need to look at how to finance circular economy or circular commerce, where the need for recycling needs to be looked at, where products will not be, hardware will not be produced in the same rapid pace as we are seeing, but services will be provided as a stream out of the hardware. In that scenario, how do you provide financing? The second is pricing models will have to change. It's not just pricing models, but the whole spectrum of risk management. How do you approach the shares that are accounted for by public, private, and other parts of the economy? Consumption, certainly consumption trends have been changing in line with the circular economy type of thinking. Material use will be shifting, and physical infrastructure will need to change, certainly in line with that, and a lot of innovation will be needed. And while there is a shift in paradigm is taking place, that sustainable business is better business, but certainly that same logic may not apply to small and particularly micro enterprises, but also to small enterprises, because for them profitability would be the bottom line. So how do you kind of marry these two things would certainly be an issue. And the last thing is, because of the complexity and because of the multitude of dimensions, a lot more policy and analytical work is needed, and funding would be needed, whether it comes from private sector or public sector. And finally, as a last point, there was despite the complexity, I thought in the panel as well as in the interactions with the audience, there was remarkable convergence of thinking and ideas. Just to give you one example, I posed a question citing a member of parliament from Denmark, whom I met recently at World Economic Forum meetings. Now, she has written a piece which is on the WEF website. Just to quote, all products will have become services by 2030. And she said, I don't own anything. I don't have a car. I don't have a house. I don't even have appliances. So I posed the question to the panelists, how do businesses survive? What do they produce? How would finance work? What would public sector's reaction to this in terms of job creation and so on? But there was remarkable convergence that we need to continuously innovate by innovating more. So that's a summary. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think we've got a session on circular economy tomorrow.
Okay.
And you're talking interestingly there about the sharing economy and what does that mean going forward. And finally, last but not least, Nagesh, SDG 10.
Thank you, Malcolm. Inequalities was the focus of this panel on SDG 10. And as you know, inequalities is not only a standalone goal, but it is also included in all different goals where SDG agenda talks about leaving no one behind, and universal access to health, universal access to education, universal access to energy, and all different amenities of life. So it is a cross-cutting agenda as well as it is a standalone agenda in SDGs. And because it is so pervasive all across, it was felt that it is like an orphan goal and that no one may take care of it. So that was a concern raised. What could be done to address inequalities? I think it was very clearly coming out in the discussion that governments need to address and focus on the excluded sections, the marginalized sections, the these people who are the farthest to be reached, the poorest of the society, through extra special programs, including through conditional cash transfers, which push these excluded people to invest in health and education and other empowering tools. So government's role in empowering excluded sections of society, whether they are excluded because of sex or gender or race or ethnicity, or because of distance they are in distant places in the country. So exclusion needs to be addressed. Then raising resources for the government through progressive taxation to invest in the equality and inclusion would be very important. It was also raised in our session that we need to develop new models, new business models, where the workers become owners of the businesses, and that might lead to greater equality in society. The businesses need to pay attention to developing affordable products and services to address for instance, the telecom divide or digital divide. And some companies are responding to that by developing ultra cheap services as telecom companies in India, for instance. And they also need to address this issue of creation of job opportunities for the vulnerable and excluded sections. There was also a suggestion made in this session that companies may be required to report, like they do about the financial viability in profits and loss. They may be required to report on what they did in the previous year about the inequalities, about the sustainability. So this could be a new reporting requirement in the context of SDGs. Finally, there was an emphasis on the importance of global partnership and multi-stakeholder partnerships for addressing the inequalities. And I think this is something which is cutting across all different goals. And one more point was about the small and marginal farmers. The viability of these farms is a challenge, and what can be done to make these small and marginal farms more viable through new development models, new business models, connecting them to the value chains, and because it was felt that the middleman, so take away all the surplus or resources. And if we can develop models to connect these small and marginal farmers with the value chains, that might make them more viable. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. In the interest of time, I'm not going to ask you a question because you actually answered the question I was going to ask, which was about partnerships. And you all mentioned the word partnership, and you all mentioned the word linkage between different goals. So if I could ask you to round of applause for the panel. Thank you very much indeed, everybody.